January cold in Baltimore is the kind that gets into your marrow, the kind that makes people stop caring about anyone but themselves. At 2:40 in the morning, Maren Kowalczyk pedaled her beat-up bicycle through the alley behind the warehouses in Fells Point, the shortcut she'd taken every night for 2 years, familiar enough that she knew every pothole with her eyes closed. 41 deliveries that day had earned her $112, still $340 short of what was due tomorrow. All she wanted was to get home, peel off her soaked gloves, and sleep 4 hours before the morning shift. Then she saw a man's leather glove lying in the snow. In this city, minding your own business isn't good manners, it's survival. Maren understood that better than most. She meant to ride straight past. But the glove moved, and through the wind cutting between the brick walls, she heard a ragged, broken breath, the kind of sound that someone who'd spent 3 years in an emergency room can't hear and pretend she didn't. The man lay slumped behind a stack of wooden pallets, blood pooling dark beneath a thin layer of snow. He was nearly gone. Maren knelt, pressed 2 fingers to his neck, and in those 3 short seconds, she made the decision that would change the rest of her life. She dragged a dying stranger back to her basement apartment. She stitched him closed with an ordinary needle and half a bottle of cheap liquor. The biggest mistake she ever made, because when morning came, the stranger was gone, the floor wiped clean, the blanket folded into a neat square, and on the table lay a single sheet of paper that made her hands shake. Outside the door, pressed into the snow, were 2 sets of footprints that weren't hers. If you were Maren that night, would you have ridden past, or would you have stopped? Leave your answer in the comments, and hit that like button if this story reached you. Subscribe and share it with someone who still believes kindness is worth the risk, because what comes next will surprise you even more. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the gray winter sunlight slipped through the small window near the ceiling, and Maren stood in the middle of her basement apartment without recognizing it anymore. The kitchen floor had been mopped, not carelessly, but thoroughly, scrubbed with the cleaning solution she kept beneath the sink, until the old vinyl flooring was clean enough to reveal faint patterns she had forgotten were ever there. The only wool blanket in the apartment had been folded into a neat square and placed carefully over the back of the only chair she owned. The scrap of cotton cloth she had used to stop the bleeding the night before was gone. The bottle of cheap liquor was gone. Even the spool of thread and the needle were gone. The man who had lain on this kitchen floor 7 hours earlier, the man whose broken breaths she had listened to until dawn was close, had left no trace proving he had ever existed, except for 2 things on the table. Maren walked toward it slowly, as though the table itself might explode. The first thing was her stack of mail. She remembered clearly that the night before it had been scattered in a disorderly heap beside the sink. Several white envelopes stamped with red lettering that she had stopped opening months ago. Now they had been arranged into a perfectly straight stack, every edge aligned, and the letter on top wasn't the one that had been there the night before. It was a payment notice from the facility where Wesley was living. Someone had pulled it from the pile, placed it on top, and circled the amount of $1,900 in black ink. The line was dark and decisive, without the slightest tremor. The second thing beside it was a thick white card, with no name, no address, no logo, only 10 embossed digits in the center. Maren didn't touch either of them. She stood perfectly still, both hands still marked by the deep impressions left by the cargo straps, and the cold that traveled down her spine didn't come from the winter outside. That man had read her mail. While she slept in the chair less than 3 steps away from him, he had sat up with 12 stitches in his side, moved through her kitchen, and read every envelope one by one. He knew whom she owed. He knew how much she was short. He knew she had a younger brother. Maren had thought the most frightening thing about the previous night was the amount of blood on the floor. She had been wrong. The most frightening thing was that now, with everything scrubbed clean, she finally understood that for those 7 hours, she had been inside her own home, with someone who had studied her more closely than anyone ever had in her entire life. She stepped back from the table. The first thought that crossed her mind was to call the police, and she dismissed it immediately, just as quickly as she had dismissed it at 2:40 in the morning, when those 3 dry words had been spoken from this kitchen floor. Her second thought was to call Wesley. She took out her phone, stared at the cracked screen, then lowered it again. At this hour, her brother would be eating breakfast. If she called at 7 o'clock in the morning, the first thing he would ask was what had happened, and Maren had never been able to lie to her brother over the phone. She put on her coat, unlocked the door, and climbed the concrete steps leading up to street level. It was still early, and the street was empty. The snow from the night before had frozen into a hard, smooth layer, the kind of snow that preserved everything pressed into it. Maren looked down. There were her footprints, 2 uneven trails dragging through the snow from the night before, where she had braced the cargo cart against the doorstep. But over them, pressing them deeper, were 2 other sets of boot prints, much larger than hers, flat soles, with none of the patterned tread of athletic shoes. They led from the curb all the way to her door, stopped there for a while, then turned back toward the street, and between those 2 sets of prints was a faint, dragging mark, the trace left by someone being supported beneath both shoulders. Maren stood on those steps for a long time, her breath dissolving into white mist before her face. Someone had come to collect him. Someone had known exactly where to go, and exactly when to arrive, which meant this basement apartment, this address where she had lived for 2 years without anyone caring enough to visit, now existed in the minds of people whose faces she didn't know at all. She went back inside and slid the bolt into place. The cheap lock she knew would give way with a single kick. She sat down in the chair beneath the neatly folded blanket, and for the first time since dawn, she allowed herself to tremble. Not because she was afraid of dying. Maren had lived in this neighborhood long enough to understand that death wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a person. She trembled because of another thought, smaller and more persistent. One that had clung to her ever since she saw the number circled on that page. The man hadn't circled the amount she owed. He had circled the amount her brother needed. And Maren couldn't understand why a man dying in the snow would do such a thing before he had even taken care of his own wound. She looked once more at the white card on the table, the 10 digits lying still like an invitation she had no desire to accept. Then she stood, deciding she would take a shower, go to her afternoon shift, continue living her worn and ordinary life, and pretend the previous night had never happened. She had taken only 3 steps toward the bathroom when someone knocked on the door. 3 knocks. Slow. Even. Maren stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, and 3 possibilities raced through her mind. The landlord never knocked at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning. A neighbor wouldn't knock 3 times, slow and even, like that. And the third possibility was one she didn't want to consider. She gave the kitchen one last quick glance. The floor was clean. The table was clean. There was nothing left to hide. And then she did what the instincts of someone who lived in this neighborhood told her to do. She opened the door instead of leaving it shut, because refusing to open it was the kind of thing that made people remember you. She kept the security chain fastened and pulled the door open exactly 2 inches. The woman standing in the hallway was close to 50, with salt and pepper hair tied low at the nape of her neck, a wool coat that was old but neatly pressed, and a paper cup of coffee gone cold in one hand. She raised her badge just long enough for Maren to read it, then lowered it at once, the gesture of someone who didn't need to intimidate anyone. Detective Corinne Brault, Baltimore Police Department. She didn't ask whether she could come inside. She simply stood there, taking half a step back to widen the space between them, and said she was sorry for arriving so early, then asked whether Maren had worked the night shift. Maren said yes. Brault asked what time her shift had ended. Maren said around 2:30, and she told the truth because she knew her final delivery was recorded in the system, complete with a timestamp and coordinates, and lying about something that could be checked was the fastest way to put a rope around her own neck. Brault nodded, wrote it down in a small notebook, then said in the calm voice of someone having a conversation, rather than conducting an interrogation, that someone had reported a considerable amount of blood that morning in the alley behind the warehouses at Fells Point, about 2 blocks away, and that the blood hadn't remained in one place but continued in a trail along the pavement. She stopped there and let the silence do its work. Maren didn't fill it. 3 years working in an emergency room had taught her that the person who talked the most was always the most afraid. Brault waited long enough, then asked whether Maren had passed through that alley. This was where Maren had to lie, so she lied by telling almost the entire truth. She said yes, she had taken that route every night for the past 2 years, because it was 7 minutes shorter than going around. She said the snow had been heavy the night before, the alley light had been broken since autumn, and she had ridden through at the speed of someone who wanted nothing more than to get home. She said she hadn't seen any blood, and that was true, because the first thing she had seen wasn't blood, but a leather glove lying in the snow. Brault asked whether she had heard anything. Maren said the wind had been loud, and that was true as well, because she had needed to bend down very close before she could hear that rasping breath. Brault turned to another page in her notebook, then asked a question that tightened Maren's stomach. She asked whether Maren knew why the light in this basement apartment had still been on close to 4 o'clock in the morning, because someone in the building had said it was. Maren didn't hesitate for even half a second. She said she made nighttime deliveries, that if she came home at 3 o'clock in the morning, being awake at 4 was perfectly normal, that she still had to wash her wet clothes and eat something before going to sleep, and that if the detective wanted to check, she could ask anyone in the building what time Maren's light had gone out during the past 2 years. She said it in the voice of someone too exhausted to be angry, and that was exactly how an innocent person worn down by fatigue would speak. Brault studied her through the 2-inch opening, looking longer than courtesy allowed, and there was no suspicion in her eyes. There was something else. Something Maren couldn't read, and it was frightening precisely because she couldn't read it. Then Brault closed her notebook. She said, "Thank you, dear. Nothing more." And that word, dear, fell between them like a pebble dropped into still water. No one had spoken to Maren that way in 8 years. Brault took one step away, then stopped at the threshold, still holding the cold cup of coffee, and asked one more question, one that wasn't written in the notebook, and didn't belong to any official procedure, in a voice so gentle it almost sounded like concern. She asked whether Wesley was 19 now. Maren didn't answer. She couldn't. The entire hallway suddenly became so quiet that she could hear water moving through the pipes behind the wall. Brault didn't wait for a response. She nodded, very slightly, as though silence itself had already answered her, then reached into her coat pocket and passed a business card through the opening. She said that if there was anything Maren wanted to tell her, at any time, even in the middle of the night, she should call. She put just enough emphasis on the word anything that it no longer sounded like a polite formality. Then she left. The sound of her shoes faded along the concrete floor, slow and even, exactly like the 3 knocks on the door. Maren pushed the door closed, slid the bolt into place, and stood there with the business card in her hand. She replayed the entire conversation in her mind, from the first sentence to the last, without missing a single word. She had spoken about her shift. She had spoken about the alley. She had spoken about the light, the snow, and the wind. She had answered 6 questions without making a single mistake. Then her back slowly slid down the door until she was sitting on the cold floor. And what made both her hands turn cold wasn't the blood outside, and it wasn't the boot prints in the snow. It was this. During that entire conversation, Maren hadn't once mentioned her brother's name. There is one thing people who have never been poor will never understand, and that is that poor people don't have the right to stay home when they are afraid. Maren had lain on the mattress all morning without sleeping, her eyes open and fixed on the ceiling, while the last question that woman had asked ran through her mind again and again. At noon she got up, not because she had calmed down, but because she opened her banking app and saw the balance of $112 sitting there, and beneath it a reminder that an automatic payment would be withdrawn on Tuesday. Fear was a luxury, rent wasn't. At 6 o'clock that evening, she was at the warehouse, exactly as she was every day, exactly as she had been for the past 2 years. The warehouse stood behind a row of storefronts that had been closed since the recession, with high ceilings, fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead, and the smell of cardboard mixed with machine oil into something Maren had grown so accustomed to that she no longer noticed it. Ruth Abernathy stood behind the dispatch counter, 71 years old, her glasses hanging from a cord around her neck, and she saw Maren the moment she pushed through the door. She didn't ask whether Maren was all right. She simply bent down, pulled a warm cardboard box from beneath the counter, shoved it into her hands, then grumbled that she had lost weight again, that the coat had still fit her last month, and that if she kept eating this way at her age, she would pay for it by the time she was 40. Maren started to say she had already eaten. Ruth raised one hand to stop her, told her not to waste her breath, then turned back to arranging paperwork as though the matter were settled. Maren held the food box, and for one very brief moment, her throat tightened for a reason that had nothing to do with blood or the police. She sat in the plastic chair in the corner of the break room and ate, quickly, like someone afraid another person might come and take the food away. Dean passed by, 24 years old, one earbud in his ear, a stack of route sheets tucked against his chest. He pulled one free and handed it to Maren, told her the route had changed for the night, that road construction on the east side had forced the system to move all the deliveries onto the inner harbor route, and that she should check the reporting times to make sure everything matched. He spoke in the weary voice of someone who had worked nights for 3 years and hated every minute of it. Maren folded the paper, slipped it into her coat pocket, thanked him, and Dean kept walking, and neither of them gave the exchange another second of thought. At 9 o'clock that night, the warehouse had begun to empty, and Maren sat in the break room waiting for her next delivery. She took out her phone, its screen webbed with cracks, the replacement she had been postponing since summer, and opened the news simply to pass the time, simply to keep her mind from returning to the 3 knocks on her door that morning. The lead story caught her eye before she could even read the headline, because the background image showed the cranes at the port of Baltimore, a sight Maren had avoided looking at for 11 years. She read the headline, then she read it a second time. A purge in the Southern Port District late Friday night into early Saturday morning. The newly installed head of the Vespari family had been ambushed during a meeting believed to have been arranged by someone on the inside. 6 people had been arrested during raids the following morning. Federal authorities had joined the investigation and were working with the city police department. And near the end of the article, written in the cautious language of newsrooms that didn't want to be sued, was a brief sentence stating that the head of the family had not yet reappeared, that his condition remained unknown, and that unconfirmed sources suggested he had been seriously wounded. Maren read that sentence 3 times. Her finger rested motionless on the screen for a long while. Then she scrolled down. There was an archive photograph in the middle of the article. It had been taken 2 years earlier at the opening ceremony for some warehouse at the port, and the image quality wasn't good. The man in the photograph wasn't looking directly at the camera. He was turning his head to one side, as though someone had just called his name. Neatly cut black hair, broad shoulders beneath a dark coat, and along the left side of his jaw was a faint scar, the kind of old scar that had healed many years ago, so pale that anyone who didn't look closely might mistake it for a shadow. Maren had looked closely at that scar. She had seen it from less than a foot away beneath the yellow kitchen light in her basement apartment, while wiping snow and mud from his neck to find his pulse. She had seen it once more at 4 o'clock in the morning, when she bent down to make sure he was still breathing, and she remembered thinking something foolish, that the scar must have been very old, that he must have gotten it when he was still young. The phone in her hand suddenly felt as heavy as a brick. The buzzing fluorescent lights overhead, the sound of someone pulling a cart across the warehouse floor, Ruth calling out the name of some delivery driver, all of it receded and blurred into the distance. Maren sat motionless in the plastic chair, and the first thing she thought about wasn't the words Vespari family, or the 6 people who had been arrested, or the federal authorities. The first thing she thought about was the 3 dry words the man had spoken from her kitchen floor. No hospital, no police, and the way he had said them, without pleading, without panic, but in the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders even while he was dying. She had thought it was fear. Now she understood it was habit. Maren slowly lowered the phone, placed it face down on her lap, then looked at her hands. There were still traces of iodine beneath her fingernails. A red mark from the cargo strap remained pressed across the back of her right hand, and those were the hands that had placed 12 stitches in the left side of the man in that photograph less than 20 hours earlier, using an ordinary needle and half a bottle of cheap liquor, on her own kitchen floor. Maren completed all 29 deliveries on her night shift, without remembering a single one of them, and by the time she reached home, the sky had already turned pale with morning. She slept for exactly 4 hours in the clothes she was still wearing. When she woke at noon, the first thing she did wasn't look at the white card on the table, and it wasn't open the news report again. She called Wesley. She called because she needed to hear a voice with nothing hidden behind it. The phone rang twice before her brother answered, and the first thing he said wasn't, "Hello." But guess what I did today? Maren leaned her back against the kitchen wall, closed her eyes, and said she gave up. Wesley told her he had just finished the painting he had started 3 weeks earlier, the one of the harbor at sunset, and that he had needed to throw out the entire old sky because the orange had turned muddy. He had mixed it again from the beginning, and this time it was right, exactly the color he remembered seeing when the 2 of them used to walk along the waterfront in the afternoon. He said the cranes in the painting were nothing but dark outlines now, that he hadn't painted in the details, because from far away, who could ever see the details anyway? Maren listened, and she realized she was smiling, though after the past 2 days the muscles of her face had grown so stiff that it took them a moment to remember how. She asked whether he planned to hang it. Wesley said it depended, that he would have to wait and see, because a painting always looked beautiful the moment you finished it, and you had to leave it alone for 3 days before looking again to know whether it truly was. Then he fell quiet for a moment, and asked whether she had slept. Maren said she had. He asked how many hours. She said enough. Wesley laughed. The laugh of someone who knew perfectly well he had just been lied to, but had no intention of making an issue of it. Then asked whether she had eaten dinner. Maren said she had, that she had eaten, that there had even been soup. The words came smoothly because she had spoken them hundreds of times over the past 8 years. Wesley said good, then reminded her not to skip meals and not to live on coffee before going to work, because she had been doing that all month. Maren asked how he knew. Wesley said it was her voice. She talked faster when she was hungry. Then he said goodbye because he was going to eat dinner, told her she could come see the painting over the weekend, and ended the call before Maren could say anything else. Maren stood motionless in the kitchen for a long time with the phone still pressed to her ear. This was the reason. This was the entire reason she wasn't allowed to collapse, wasn't allowed to remain afraid for too long, wasn't allowed to lie on the mattress staring at the ceiling until noon. Because 40 minutes away by bus, there was a 19-year-old waiting for the weekend, so he could show his sister a painting of the harbor at sunset, and he knew nothing at all. And Maren would do anything to make sure he continued, knowing nothing at all. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. It wasn't 3 slow, evenly spaced knocks. This time it was the bell, and the person outside was a courier, wearing a company windbreaker, holding a scanner in one hand, asking whether she was M. Kowalczyk before presenting her with a stiff envelope the size of an A4 sheet. Maren signed for it. She looked at the sender field. It was blank. No name, no address, only a tracking number and a stamp from the downtown post office. She carried the envelope into the kitchen, placed it on the table, and spent nearly a minute before opening it, because her mind had already conjured the image of stacks of $100 bills she would somehow have to return. There was no money inside. There were only 2 sheets of paper. The first was a confirmation letter from a debt collection company, printed on official letterhead, with a case number and a scanned signature. It stated that the entire outstanding balance connected to the medical expenses of Mrs. Helena Kowalczyk, an amount of $41,000, had been purchased by a third party and paid in full, that the account was now closed, and that no remaining obligation existed for her heirs. The second was a receipt from the facility where Wesley was living, confirming that 6 months of fees beginning that month had been paid in advance, with a note stating that the payment was non-refundable. Maren read the first page from beginning to end. Then she read the second. Then she returned to the first and read it again, more slowly, as though the number might be different this time. It wasn't. Her knees weakened, and she sank onto the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet door, still holding both sheets of paper in her hands. $41,000. 8 years. 8 years of paying it down $100 at a time, some months managing only 40, some months having to call and ask for an extension while someone recited the penalty terms in the flat voice of a person reading the weather. 8 years of being unable to buy a new coat, of avoiding the dentist, of not daring to become sick. Those 8 years had vanished in a single morning because of a man whose name she hadn't known, whose face she hadn't seen before that night, and now she knew both his name and his face, which made it worse. She remained on the floor for a long time. Then her eyes, tired and blurred, drifted toward the footer of the first page, where the smallest print listed the name of the legal entity that had represented the transaction. She didn't read it carefully. She only glanced over it for half a second, the way people glanced over the final line of an insurance contract. But something tightened inside her chest, a faint pressure, neither painful nor clear, exactly like the feeling of someone who had just passed a doorway where they had once stood a very long time ago, long enough to remember the smell of the hallway, yet couldn't remember when it had happened or why they had been standing there. Maren didn't sleep that night. She lay listening to the pipes inside the wall and thinking about the 2 sheets of paper resting on the kitchen table, 3 steps away, and by around 4 o'clock in the morning, she had made her decision. She would give it back, not because she was noble, she told herself in the darkness, but because she had lived in this neighborhood long enough to understand one very simple rule, that when something arrived without a price, it only meant the price hadn't been named yet. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the moment the call center opened, she called the debt collection company. She remembered the number without looking it up. After 8 years of calling it again and again, any number became something the body knew by heart. The hold music played for 4 minutes. Then a woman's voice came on, the kind of voice trained to carry no emotion at all, and asked how she could help. Maren read out the case number. She heard the clicking of a keyboard at the other end of the line. Then she said, slowly and clearly, that she wanted to return the payment that had just been made, that she wanted the debt placed back under her name as it had been before, and that she would continue making installments according to the old schedule. There was silence on the other end for about 2 seconds. Then the woman asked her to repeat herself, not because she hadn't heard, but because she didn't believe what she had heard. Maren said it again. The keyboard began clicking once more. The woman explained, still in the flat voice of someone reading from a script, that the debt had been purchased in full by a third party on Saturday morning, that the transaction had been completed, and that the account had been closed and transferred to the archives. Maren asked where she was supposed to send the money. Then, the woman said there was nowhere to send it because the debt no longer existed. Maren asked whether there was any mechanism to reverse it. She used that exact word, reverse, because she had searched online all night, and that was the word people used on the forums. The woman said no. She said that once a debt had been paid in full by a lawful third party, the company had no authority to reinstate it, even if the beneficiary requested it. Maren asked who had paid. The woman said the purchaser's information was confidential under the terms of the agreement, and her voice softened slightly, sounding like a human being for the first time, when she added that people usually called to say thank you, Miss Kowalczyk. Maren didn't answer. She said thank you, then ended the call. She remained seated in the kitchen, on the only chair in the apartment, with the receipt resting across her lap. The January light coming through the small window near the ceiling cast a pale gray stripe across the table. Outside, there was the sound of a garbage truck and someone scraping snow. Inside, there was silence. Maren looked at the paper in her lap and read the amount of $41,000 for the 4th time, and this time, something inside her broke open. She cried, not the kind of crying that came with sobs, but the silent kind, her shoulders trembling, both hands pressed over her face, the kind of crying that belonged to someone who had practiced holding everything in for so long that when it finally came out, she no longer knew how to make a sound. She cried for 8 years, for the evenings spent in front of an old computer dividing the numbers into smaller pieces to see which meals she could afford to skip that month, for the time she had called to ask for an extension and listened while someone read the penalty terms back to her as she stood in a hospital hallway, for the winter when she made deliveries in shoes with holes in the soles and came home with her feet turned white from the cold, for the fact that she was 27 years old and had never once opened her banking app without fear. All those years had just been erased by a scanned signature, and the thing that made her cry hardest, the thing she would only admit to herself much later, wasn't gratitude, and it wasn't fear. It was that the person who had lifted that burden from her shoulders wasn't a friend, because what friends did she have? And it wasn't the government, because she had applied for assistance 3 times and been rejected all 3, and it wasn't some miracle from heaven. It was the hand of a man whose name she didn't even dare speak inside her own mind. When she had finished crying, she remained there a while longer, her face dry again, her mind empty in a way that felt both relieving and frightening, because this was the truth she now had to face. The worst thing wasn't the debt. The worst thing was that she had begun to feel relieved. She had sat there in her cold kitchen and, for one very brief moment, allowed herself to think that this weekend she might be able to buy Wesley the set of paints he had stared at through the store window for 2 summers. She had thought about getting the molar that had been aching since October examined. She had thought about sleeping. A decent person should have been disgusted by that money, but she felt lighter, and that lightness was what frightened her most, because it meant she had been bought, not through force, not through threats, but with the very thing she had begged for during 8 years when no one had listened. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she put on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, picked up her helmet, and left for work, because she hadn't missed a single shift in 2 years, and she wasn't going to begin today. She locked the door, climbed the concrete steps, and when she reached the curb, she stopped. Across the street, less than 65 feet from where she stood, a black SUV was parked close to the sidewalk. The windows were dark, and she couldn't see anything inside. The engine was still running, a thin stream of white exhaust rising steadily from the tailpipe and dissolving into the cold air, and the snow on the hood had melted away long ago, which meant it had been parked there for a very long time. Maren didn't turn her head to look at the vehicle a second time. She got on her bicycle and rode away, and for the first 4 blocks she strained to hear the sound of tires rolling behind her, but there was nothing. The street remained as quiet as it was on every other January afternoon. That shift passed beneath the strange sensation of someone who knew she was being watched but didn't know from where. Close to 11 o'clock that night, when she pushed her bicycle into the parking area behind the warehouse, an open, empty lot with only a tall floodlight and several rusted metal racks. She saw someone waiting there. A woman in her 30s stood beneath the light, wearing a long charcoal wool coat, the kind of coat whose price Maren knew because she had delivered packages to people who wore them. The woman wasn't leaning against the wall. She wasn't smoking. She wasn't looking at her phone. She simply stood upright, holding 2 steaming paper cups in both hands, watching Maren approach with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting. Maren stopped 4 steps away, one hand still resting on the handlebars. The woman said her name was Roz Kepler, then held out one of the cups. Maren didn't take it. Roz kept her hand extended without pulling it back, and said the tea was getting cold, that she had been standing there for 20 minutes, and that if Maren intended to let it go completely cold, that was fine, but it would be a waste. Maren looked at the cup. The lid bore the logo of the shop 1.5 blocks from her apartment, and written by hand along the side was the kind of tea she bought every Monday morning. Strong black tea, no sugar, with a slice of lemon. Maren took the cup, not because she wanted to drink it, but because both her hands had suddenly gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Roz came directly to the point without circling around it, and Maren recognized immediately that she was the kind of person who made her living through negotiation, the kind who understood that too much politeness only made the other person more suspicious. She said she was there to tell Maren where she truly stood in all of this, because the person who didn't know where they were standing was always the easiest one to kill. Then she told her 3 things. First, late Friday night into early Saturday morning, someone had been ambushed in the Southern Port District, and that person had come out of the alley alive, which meant someone had pulled him out of the snow. Second, the Falconieri family was now spending money and manpower to find that person at any cost, because finding the one who had dragged him away would reveal where he had been taken, who had touched him, and how weak he had been. Third, Maren wasn't the person being protected. Maren was leverage. Roz spoke the word in the calm voice of someone reading the terms of a contract, then explained that leverage was something people used to pry loose something larger, and that its value didn't lie in what it was, but in whom it was attached to. Maren asked which side the black vehicle outside her apartment belonged to. Roz said it belonged to her side, then added before Maren could speak that it wasn't following her. It was watching the street. It was there so that if an unfamiliar vehicle remained parked along that stretch of road for more than 4 minutes, someone would know. Maren stood there with the hot tea in her hands, and the anger inside her rose slowly, steadily, the kind of anger that belonged to someone who had endured too much for too long. She said she hadn't asked anyone for anything. She said she hadn't called the number on the card, hadn't accepted a single dollar, had even called and asked to have her debt returned to her and been refused. She said she only wanted to be left alone, to work her shifts, to pay her rent, and she asked why pulling a man out of the snow had turned into this. Roz listened to all of it without interrupting and without pretending to sympathize. When Maren finished, Roz took a sip of tea before answering, and what she said was the coldest thing anyone had ever said to Maren. She asked whether Maren truly believed he had paid her debt to help her. Then she answered the question herself. He was buying time. As long as Maren had to worry about money, she would still have to spend 10 hours on the street every night, traveling along the same roads, stopping at the same buildings, within the same hours that anyone willing to sit and take notes for 3 days could predict. And a person out on the street was very easy to find. When Roz finished, she fell silent. Maren couldn't answer. She stood in the empty parking lot beneath the humming floodlight, and for the first time in 3 days, she understood that the $41,000 hadn't been a gift, and it hadn't been repayment for what she had done. It had been a tactical move, and she was terrain on someone else's map. Roz set her own cup of tea on the seat of the bicycle beside them, and said that from now on, if any stranger asked Maren questions, anyone at all, she shouldn't lie, and she shouldn't tell the truth. She should simply call the number on the card. Then Roz walked toward the gate, paused for a moment, and turned back to add one last thing. She said she knew Maren had called the debt collection company that morning, and that in 7 years of working for him, she had never seen anyone do that before. Then she disappeared through the gate. That night, Maren reached home close to 2 o'clock in the morning and stopped on the concrete steps because something wasn't right. The lock on the basement door, the lock that had been broken for 2 years and that the landlord had never agreed to repair, had been replaced with a new one, its brass still gleaming beneath the hallway light. Her battered old bicycle, the one that had carried her through 2 winters with a bent front rim and a rear brake that worked only halfway, was gone from the metal rack. In its exact place stood a brand new bicycle with front and rear lights and deep tread tires made for gripping snow. Inside the basket was a piece of paper folded in half, written by hand in black ink, the strokes firm and without a tremor, exactly like the line that had circled the amount on the payment notice. There was only one sentence. "You travel in the dark too often." Maren carried the note inside, placed it on the kitchen table beside the white card and the other 2 sheets of paper, then lay down on the mattress with her coat still on. She didn't sleep. She lay listening to the pipes in the walls and the occasional car passing along the street above her, while her mind returned again and again to that feeling in the kitchen earlier that afternoon, the faint tightening in her chest when her eyes had passed over the small print at the bottom of the debt settlement letter. She had tried to push it away all evening. It wouldn't leave. It remained lodged inside her like a splinter, too small to see but sharp enough to make itself impossible to forget. And at around 3 o'clock in the morning, Maren sat up, turned on the light, knelt beside the bed, and reached underneath it. She had to stretch deep into the dust, past the suitcase with the broken lock, until her fingers touched cardboard. She pulled it out. It was a faded shoebox with a warped lid, all 4 corners sealed with tape that had yellowed and grown brittle. On the lid, written in marker in her mother's handwriting, were only 2 words: "Important papers." Maren hadn't opened the box once since her mother died. In truth, she hadn't opened it even before then, not since the spring when she was 16. She placed it on the floor, sat down beside it, and peeled away the tape. It came off easily, so dry that it no longer clung to anything. The first thing on top was her father's death certificate, Tomasz Kowalczyk. The date of death was printed in cold, mechanical type, and the cause was written in medical terms she hadn't understood at 16, and now, after 3 years working in an emergency room, understood far too well. She placed it to one side, face down. The second thing was a photograph. It had been taken with a film camera, and the colors had faded into yellow. Her father stood in front of a crane at the docks, one hand resting on his hip, his hard hat tilted sideways, smiling at the person holding the camera. Maren remembered that day. She had been the one holding the camera. She was 13, and he had made her take the picture 3 times because she kept cutting off the top of the crane. He had told her she needed to get the whole thing in the frame, because what was the point of taking a picture of only him? She looked at the photograph longer than she intended. Then she placed it face down beside the death certificate, because some things could only be endured when a person didn't look directly at them. The third thing was a thick stack of stapled papers, their edges curled with age. This was what she had been searching for: the compensation settlement agreement, $18,000. Her mother's signature was on the final page, the name Helena Kowalczyk, written in a trembling, slanted hand by a 42-year-old woman who had lost her husband 6 weeks earlier and couldn't read legal English. Maren remembered the afternoon it was signed. She remembered standing in the kitchen doorway at 16, still holding a dish towel, watching her mother bend over the table and sign each page while someone seated across from her turned the papers for her. Maren couldn't remember that person's face. 11 years had passed, and all she remembered was a dark coat draped over the back of a chair, and that the person had been very young, much younger than she imagined someone from the company would be, young enough that she had briefly wondered why they had sent some boy to the house. Maren opened the file and turned to the final page, the one bearing the signature. Then she stood, crossed the 3 steps to the kitchen table, picked up the debt settlement letter the courier had delivered the previous afternoon, carried it back, and sat down on the floor. She placed the 2 documents beside each other. On the left was the final page of the settlement file from the spring 11 years earlier. The paper yellowed, the ink faded. On the right was the newly printed laser copy, still carrying the faint smell of the printer. She lowered her eyes to the bottom of the page on the right, to the smallest print, where the legal entity representing the transaction was named. Then she looked at the bottom of the page on the left, where the office representing the paying party had placed its stamp. She read the line on the right. She read the line on the left. She read the one on the right again. It was the same name. Not something similar. Not a name with 1 or 2 words in common. The exact same name, written with the same abbreviation, even the same period after the final letter. The only difference was that the one on the left had been printed by a dot matrix printer from that year, while the one on the right had been printed by a laser printer now. Maren sat motionless. Her finger remained resting against the edge of the paper, and she heard the heater inside the wall turn on and then shut off. Once, and then once again. Outside, the sky was still dark. Inside her mind, something was rearranging itself, slowly and mercilessly, like turning a photograph right side up and realizing that from the very beginning, she had been looking at it upside down. For the past 3 days, she had been afraid. She had been afraid of the black vehicle outside, afraid of the knocking at her door, afraid of the woman who knew her brother's name, afraid of the money she couldn't return. Now, sitting on the cold floor close to 4 o'clock in the morning, Maren realized that she had been afraid of the wrong thing from the start. That January night, that alley, the leather glove lying in the snow, she had treated all of it as an accident, a cruel coincidence of fate, one moment when she had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the man lying in the snow that night hadn't been a stranger who had merely crossed through her life. He had already been part of it. Long before that January night, since the spring when her mother bent over to sign her name on that page, while 16-year-old Maren stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hand, watching. The weekend came, and Maren did exactly what she had promised over the phone. Because of all the promises she had broken in her life, she had never broken one to her brother. She caught the bus at 10 o'clock in the morning, changed lines once, and on the way she stopped at the bakery on the corner to buy a small apple pie, the kind with a crisp, sugar-dusted crust that Wesley had loved since he was a child. She paid with the loose change in her coat pocket, and for exactly 2 seconds, as she handed the money to the cashier, she nearly bought a second one, because now she could. Then she didn't. She wasn't ready for the fact that she could. The facility stood on the north side of the city, a 2-story red brick building with maple trees planted across the front lawn, and Maren signed the visitor log at the reception desk, the way she had every 2 weeks for the past 3 years. Wesley was waiting in the common room, sitting at the table beside the window that he always chose because it had the best light, and when he saw his sister, he stood up, half a head taller than she was, 19 years old, with blue paint still staining the tips of several fingers. He looked at the pastry box before he looked at her face, and said that if she had brought apple pie, it meant she was trying to apologize for something. Maren said she had nothing to apologize for. Wesley said good, then handed over. They sat down and cut the pie with a plastic knife from the cafeteria, and for the first 20 minutes, Maren thought about nothing except the fact that the crust was still crisp, and the sunlight was falling across the table in a golden stripe. When they had finished eating, Wesley went to get the painting. He carried it out with both hands, propped it upright on the chair across from her, then stepped back and said nothing, allowing his sister to look. The painting showed the harbor at sunset, and Maren, who had never understood anything about art, remained silent longer than she intended. The sky was orange, fading into a muted, earthy pink, not brilliant, not artificial, but exactly the color of those September afternoons when she and Wesley used to walk along the waterfront with their father. The cranes were nothing but dark, upright outlines, without detail, without anything specific, and because of that, they didn't hurt her. Maren asked how he had mixed the color of the sky, and Wesley, who was usually a quiet person, suddenly became completely serious. He pulled his chair closer, picked up the palette, placed a brush in her hand, and began explaining like a real teacher. He said never to squeeze orange straight from the tube and use it as it was, because orange from a tube was factory orange, not sky orange. He said she had to begin with yellow, a large amount of yellow, then add red a little at a time, and most importantly, at the very end, she had to add the smallest touch of blue, only a little, so little it was almost invisible, to bring the color down. Maren asked why anyone would put blue into orange, because wouldn't that turn it into mud? Wesley said exactly. It had to come close to mud to be right, because a real evening sky was actually a dirty color, and only bad paintings had clean skies. Maren tried. She used too much red, and the paint on the palette became the color of new brick. She started again, more cautiously this time, and ended up with a pale yellow that looked like butter left out too long. On her third attempt, she remembered to add the blue, but she pressed the brush too hard, and the entire patch of color dyed into gray. Wesley studied it, nodded with great seriousness, then said that if she ever became a painter, she would definitely starve to death. And Maren laughed, truly laughed, the sound breaking unexpectedly out of her chest, so suddenly that even she startled herself. She hadn't laughed in 3 days. It had been much longer since she had laughed like this. The two of them sat cleaning the brushes, and while they worked, Wesley asked, his voice still casual as though they were talking about paint, whether she had been sleeping lately. Maren said of course she had. Wesley didn't look up. He continued wiping the brush in his hand, then said there was something good going on, wasn't there? Because she looked different. Maren's hand stopped. She looked at her brother, 19 years old, sitting with his head lowered as he cleaned the brush in slow, careful movements. And she understood that he wasn't asking without reason. He had been watching her for the past 2 hours and had reached his conclusion before he ever opened his mouth. For one very brief moment, Maren nearly told him. She nearly said that their mother's debt was gone, that someone had paid 6 months of his fees, that she had sat crying on the kitchen floor because for the first time in 8 years she felt lighter, and that the lightness itself frightened her. But if she told him half of it, she would have to tell him the rest. The part with the alley, the snow, the needle and half a bottle of cheap liquor, the knocking at the door, and the black vehicle parked outside. So she lied. She said the warehouse had added overtime, that there were more deliveries this season, and that she had been given several extra daytime routes, so this week had been better. Wesley lifted his eyes and looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he said, "Really, that's great," lowered his head again, finished cleaning the final brush, and asked nothing more. Maren didn't know whether he believed her, and she suspected he didn't, but he had chosen not to press her, and she loved her brother for that more than she loved him for anything else. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she left. Wesley walked her to the common room door and reminded her to eat a real dinner, not the kind of dinner she claimed to have eaten over the phone, then returned to his painting. Maren walked down the hallway to the reception desk and signed her name in the departure column. She had pushed the glass door halfway open when the receptionist called after her. "Excuse me, Miss Kowalczyk. Could you wait a moment?" The woman searched beneath the counter, pulled out a yellow sticky note, and handed it to her, saying that someone had called that morning asking about Maren's visiting schedule, asking which day of the week she usually came and around what time. Maren took the note. She asked who had called. The receptionist said the caller hadn't given a name. Maren asked whether they had left a number. The receptionist shook her head and said the caller had told her there was no need, that they would call again later. Maren held that yellow sticky note in her hand for the entire bus ride home, and by the time she stepped off at her stop, it had been crushed into a wrinkled ball in her palm. She couldn't sleep that night, and she couldn't sleep the following night either, and by Monday morning she had picked up the white card twice and set it down again, because calling that number would mean admitting that she had already crossed over to the other side. At 9 o'clock in the morning, someone knocked on the door. 3 knocks. Slow. Even. Maren knew who it was before she reached the door. This time she opened it all the way without fastening the chain, and Corinne Brault stood there in the same old wool coat, holding the same paper cup of coffee as before, except now she had a thick file tucked beneath one arm. She didn't raise her badge. She only asked whether she could come in, and she truly asked. Standing there and waiting for an answer instead of moving even half a step forward, the way people did when they came knocking on the doors of the poor, Maren stepped aside. Brault entered the kitchen, looked around once with the eyes of someone trained to remember everything, then pulled out the chair and sat down without waiting to be invited. She placed the file on the table. The paper had yellowed along the edges, the cardboard cover had gone soft and worn at all 4 corners, and the label on the front bore a handwritten line in faded ballpoint ink. Maren didn't need to read it. She recognized the name Locust Point from 3 feet away, and she remained standing where she was, her arms hanging at her sides. Brault opened the file, turned to a page with a photograph, and rotated the papers toward Maren. Crane accident at the Locust Point docks. 4 people dead. Official investigative conclusion, printed in bold on the final line of the summary page. Operator error. Maren stared at those words. She had read them for the first time when she was 16, on a copy her mother had received through the mail, and she remembered her mother reading the phrase operator error again and again with her limited English, asking Maren what it meant, and Maren having to translate for her that they were saying her father had made a mistake. Brault allowed the silence to last exactly as long as it needed to. Then she said, without circling the point or preparing the way, that your father didn't make any operating error. Maren looked up. Brault turned to another page, pointed to a table of specifications, and continued in the measured voice of someone who had rehearsed these words in her mind far too many times. She said the main load cable had worn beyond the permitted limit and was 14 months overdue for replacement, and the maintenance records proved it, with dates and the inspector's signature. She said that on that day, Tomasz Kowalczyk had verbally reported an unusual sound coming from the winch to the shift supervisor and had been ordered to continue operating until the shipment was finished. She said 2 witnesses had heard that response, and both had withdrawn their statements within 3 weeks. Then she said the words that forced Maren to grip the edge of the table. "I was the one who wrote that conclusion, with my own hand, and they made me write it that way." Maren sat down in the remaining chair. She asked who had made her do it. Brault didn't answer immediately. She turned to a page near the back, an official letter bearing an administrative stamp, and rotated it toward Maren. She said the case had been closed at the formal request of the port operator's insurance company on the grounds that the matter had been settled privately by the parties and that further investigation wouldn't serve the public interest. She said that insurance company was, on paper, a limited liability company headquartered in an office district on the east side, but in reality, it had been under the control of the Vespari family for nearly 20 years before the accident, and remained under that control to this day. Maren heard the name fall between them in her kitchen, and she didn't react at all. She didn't flinch or ask Brault to repeat it, because over the past 6 days, she had learned that the name existed everywhere in her life. She simply hadn't known how to read its traces before. Brault watched that reaction, or rather, she watched the absence of one, and something in her expression changed, sharpening into the look of someone who had just confirmed a theory. She said she had kept the file box in the trunk of her car for 11 years. She said she had changed cars 3 times and carried it with her every time. She said she had filed 2 petitions to reopen the case, once in the 3rd year and once in the 7th, and both had been denied with the same single line of reasoning. Then she placed her hand on the file cover and said the words that sent a freezing chill down Maren's spine. She said that of everyone in this file, 4 people were dead. One of the 2 witnesses had died. The other had moved to another state and could no longer be reached. And your mother was gone too. You are the only thing in this file still alive, and you are the only living thing standing close enough to him. The kitchen fell silent. The heater inside the wall turned on and then shut off. Maren looked at the woman sitting across from her, the woman who had called her dear, who had asked about Wesley in a voice as gentle as a neighbor checking in, the woman who had just placed on her table the truth Maren had waited 11 years for, without ever daring to hope it existed, and she understood everything at once. Brault hadn't come to protect her. Brault had never come to protect her. She had come the first time to confirm whether Maren was truly the person from the alley, and she had come this time because she had finished a shift confirming it. Maren wasn't a witness who needed protection. She was the only open door into a room this woman had been knocking on for 11 years. Maren asked what she wanted her to do. Brault said she wasn't asking for anything yet. She had only come so Maren would know the truth about her father, and what Maren chose to do with that truth was entirely up to her. But she said those words while leaving her hand resting on the file, with no intention of taking it back. She stood, thanked Maren for the glass of water she hadn't had time to pour, then walked to the door, leaving the 11-year-old file on Maren's kitchen table. Maren remained alone in the cold kitchen, with 3 things before her: the white card bearing 10 digits, the letter confirming the cancellation of $41,000 in debt, and the yellowed file bearing her father's name. On one side were the people who had paid her debt and circled the amount her brother needed. On the other was the woman who had written the conclusion falsely blaming her father, then kept it in her car trunk for 11 years while waiting for someone like Maren to appear. And Maren understood the cruelest thing of all, that this time the person asking her to gamble her life was the one standing on the side of justice, while the person who had paid her mother's debt stood on the other side. There was nowhere left for her to belong. Maren left the file on the kitchen table. She didn't put it away, and she didn't open it again. Then she went to work her afternoon shift, because it was the only thing in her life that still held its old shape. Just before 6 o'clock, she pushed open the warehouse door and stepped into the hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of cardboard, and Ruth saw her from behind the dispatch counter. But this time, she didn't shove a box of food into Maren's hands. She set down her pen, walked around the counter, took Maren by the elbow, and led her toward the break room without saying a word. She closed the door behind them. Then she stood there, 71 years old, her back slightly stooped, her glasses dangling from their cord, and she couldn't make herself speak. Maren waited. She looked at Ruth's hands and saw that they were trembling. The small, steady tremor she had seen hundreds of times in the emergency room, the kind caused by fear, not age. Ruth removed her glasses, wiped them against the hem of her shirt, even though they weren't dirty, put them back on, and finally managed to speak. She said she knew she had no right to stand there and tell Maren any of this. Then she told her. She said that on Saturday afternoon, she had gone to Dean's room looking for the key to the cold storage area and had found a thick envelope of cash on his desk, not fully opened. She said she had asked him about it, and Dean had lied to her exactly once, only once, before sitting down on the edge of the bed and telling her everything. A man had approached him in the parking lot on Wednesday. The man hadn't asked anything about Maren. He hadn't asked her name, her address, or where she lived. He had only asked to buy the warehouse shift schedule for the next 2 weeks and the list of routes assigned to every worker. Those things had been lying right there on Dean's desk. They weren't secrets. They were only printed sheets handed out to 30 people every night. The man had paid $2,000 in cash. Ruth spoke the amount, and her voice broke halfway through. She said the boy owed tuition for 2 semesters, that the school had sent a 3rd letter, and that he worked nights there for wages she knew perfectly well because she was the one who signed the timesheets. She said she wasn't telling Maren that to ask her to forgive him. She said she was telling her so she would understand that he hadn't sold her because he was a bad person. He had sold her because he was drowning. Then Ruth stopped and added that the reason didn't make what he had done any less wrong. Maren said nothing. Ruth straightened her back, and her voice changed, becoming firm in the way of someone who had already made her decision before entering the room. She asked Maren whether she knew why Ruth was telling her. Maren shook her head. Ruth said that if she stayed silent, she would be selling Maren a second time. She said she had thought about it for 2 days. She had thought about saying nothing, returning the money, making Dean quit, and pretending none of it had ever happened. And she said she had nearly done exactly that, because he was her grandson, because his parents were gone, and because she was the only person he had left in the world. Then she said she had realized that if she remained silent to protect him, Maren would be the one paying the price for that silence, not Ruth. And she said she wasn't old enough to do such a thing, even though she was already 71. Maren stood in the small break room beside the plastic table and the humming refrigerator and waited for the anger to come. She waited several seconds. It didn't come. She thought about Dean, 24 years old, one earbud in his ear, walking through the warehouse with a stack of route sheets in his arms, and the expression of someone who hated every minute of the job. And she thought about the moment he had sat inside a stranger's car and watched an envelope of cash slide toward him. $2,000? Maren knew exactly what $2,000 meant. It meant being able to breathe. It meant not having to call and ask for more time, while someone recited the penalty terms in the flat voice of a person reading the weather. And that was what frightened her. Not that Dean had sold her, but that she couldn't feel angry with him. Because 8 days earlier, at 2:40 in the morning, she had stood before a choice just like his in the alley behind the warehouses. And the thing that had almost made her ride straight past wasn't cruelty. It was the $340 she was still short, and the thought that if she stopped, she would lose her morning shift the next day. She had stopped, but she remembered clearly how close she had come to not stopping. People didn't become bad through a single leap. They were pushed there by sums of money just small enough to forgive themselves for taking. Ruth stepped closer, took Maren's hands in her old hands that were still trembling, and said in a voice that had grown very quiet, "Listen to me. Don't take the old route anymore. Don't follow the same streets. Don't stop in the places where you always stop. Whatever area the system sends you to, accept the delivery, but take the long way around. Go slowly if you have to. Earn less if you have to." Maren asked whether Ruth had already told Dean that she was going to tell her. Ruth said yes. She said the boy had cried, and that she had made him write down everything he could remember about the man. Then she pulled a piece of paper, folded into quarters from her pocket, and handed it to Maren. Outside, the shift alarm began sounding over the speakers. The loading doors rolled upward, and carts rattled across the concrete floor. Maren took the paper and slipped it into her coat pocket. She thanked Ruth. Then she opened the break room door, walked back into the warehouse, signed in for her shift, and accepted that night's route sheet from the dispatcher on duty. Because Ruth was right, and Maren knew she was right, but the rent was still due on Tuesday, and a person couldn't live on advice. That night, Maren followed Ruth's advice for the first 6 hours. She took longer routes. She didn't stop at her usual coffee shop halfway through the shift, and she kept her phone in an inside pocket instead of fastening it to the handlebars. But by nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, she had completed 23 deliveries and earned only $89. And when the system offered her one final order in the Inner Harbor District with double the usual bonus because it was already late, She accepted it. She accepted because the rent was due Tuesday. That was the entire reason. And later, whenever Maren looked back on what happened, she always stopped at that moment, at the thought that the worst things in her life had always begun with a very small calculation. The building was a 14-story glass office tower, its lobby brightly lit, but with no one at the reception desk, and the order instructed her to deliver it directly to the 9th floor. She went up, left the bag of food outside the door as directed, took a photograph, then headed back down. She pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator doors closed, the car descended, and it passed the ground floor without stopping. It continued down one more level. The display changed to the letter B, and the doors opened onto a cold underground garage with a low ceiling and fluorescent lights burning only at scattered intervals. A man stood about 4 steps from the elevator. He looked close to 40, short and heavily built, wearing a black leather jacket with both hands inside his pockets, and he didn't move toward her. He simply stood there watching, with the gaze of someone who had been waiting a long time and had no reason to hurry. Maren pressed the button to close the doors. They didn't move. He told her she could keep pressing it if she wanted, but the cycle wouldn't reset for 4 minutes. Then he said her name, her first and last, pronouncing the soft Polish consonant correctly, the one Americans never managed to say. And Maren knew immediately that whatever was happening wasn't a robbery. He introduced himself as Renzo. He said he had no intention of hurting her, that he only wanted to talk, and that if he had wanted to do something to her, he would have done it already, instead of standing there with both hands in his pockets. Then he began to speak, slowly and calmly, like someone reading back a list. He mentioned late Friday night, into early Saturday morning, the alley behind the warehouses in Fells Point. He said a leather glove had slipped off and was lying about 3 feet from where the man had fallen, and it was still there the following morning. He said there had been a trail dragged through the snow, and it wasn't the kind left by someone being pulled by the legs. It was the kind left by someone being strapped onto something with wheels. He said the trail continued for 2 blocks before disappearing, and within that 2-block radius, only 3 buildings had basement entrances. Maren said nothing. He continued, saying that the man lying in the snow that night had suffered a long cut along his left side, not a gunshot wound, and that whoever had stitched it closed hadn't used medical sutures, but ordinary sewing thread, the kind people bought at a grocery store. He said only someone who knew what they were doing could have managed that. Then he tilted his head and said 3 years as an emergency room technician was enough to know what to do. Maren felt both hands turn cold. He didn't ask her a single question. He didn't need to. He was only showing her how much he knew. Then he took his right hand out of his pocket. There was nothing in it, and he slowly read aloud, clearly pronouncing every word, the full name of the facility on the north side of the city, the street where it stood, and its weekend visiting hours from 10 o'clock in the morning until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He recited it in the voice of someone reading a delivery address. Then he fell silent. Nothing else was said. Not one threat. Not one sentence beginning with if. Not one other name. Only those words, suspended in the cold basement between them, and both of them understood exactly what they meant. Maren could hear her heartbeat pounding inside her ears. She said she didn't know anything. Renzo nodded and said yes. Everyone said that, then stepped forward twice and seized her left wrist. Her right hand was holding the U-shaped bicycle lock she always removed and carried with her, and she swung it once. He released her, staggering backward, and Maren rushed past him toward the emergency door marked by the glowing exit sign in the corner of the garage. She shoved it open, burst into the stairwell, and ran. She ran upward instead of down because down was a dead end, and she climbed all 14 floors without stopping, the sound of her own breathing striking the concrete walls, until she forced open the rooftop door and climbed down the fire escape along the side of the building. She left the brand new bicycle with its front and rear lights in the parking area out front. She walked 3 blocks through the snow without running, because running made people look, then turned into an all-night diner that was still brightly lit, passed straight between the rows of booths, entered the restroom at the back, and locked the door. It smelled of bleach, and one light overhead flickered. Maren stood with her back against the door, breathing, and it took her nearly a minute to realize that her hands were trembling so badly she couldn't hold her phone. She sat down on the tiled floor. She pulled the white card from her wallet, the card she had picked up and put down more times than she could count during the past 8 days. And this time, she didn't hesitate, because this was no longer only about her. She entered the 10 digits. She pressed the phone to her ear. It rang exactly once. Then a man's voice answered, low and rough, without the slightest trace of sleep, even though it was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. And the voice said only 2 words. Speak. Maren opened her mouth, and what came out wasn't the sentence she had prepared in her mind. She said a man named Renzo had cornered her in the garage. She said he had recited the name of the facility, the visiting hours, and the street name. She said he had even recited the street name. Her voice broke halfway through, and she had to stop, pressing her forehead against the restroom door, before she managed to say 3 more words. My younger brother. The other end of the line went silent for exactly 1 beat. It wasn't the silence of someone in shock, but the silence of someone who had just placed a piece exactly where it belonged. Then the man's voice came through, and what Maren would remember for the rest of her life wasn't what he said, but the way he said it, slowly, evenly, without rising half a note, so frighteningly calm that the calm itself traveled through the phone and slowed her heartbeat like a hand settling on her shoulder. He asked where she was. She gave him the name of the diner. He asked how many people were inside. She said she couldn't remember, perhaps 4 or 5. He told her to think again. She closed her eyes, reconstructed the room in her mind, and said there were 3 people sitting at the counter, 1 person asleep at the last booth, and Then he gave her instructions, 1 step at a time, without wasting a single word. He told her not to leave through the front entrance. He told her to walk straight through the kitchen because places like that always had a rear door leading into an alley with garbage containers, and no one stopped a person wearing a delivery jacket from crossing a kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning. He told her that once she reached the alley, she should turn left, walk 15 steps to where 2 large garbage containers stood beside each other, and wait in the space between them, because the diner's camera only reached the edge of the first container. He said 4 minutes. He didn't say what would happen in 4 minutes, and Maren didn't ask. She did exactly as he said. She walked through the kitchen, and the man working there didn't even bother to look up. She pushed open the metal door and stepped into the freezing alley, turned left, counted her steps, then stood in the darkness between the 2 garbage containers, her breath dissolving into smoke in front of her face. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, headlights swept across the entrance to the alley, and a black vehicle glided toward her, stopped, and the rear door opened from the inside. Maren bent low and threw herself into the car. The door closed behind her, warmth wrapped around her, and she looked up. Roz Kepler was the only person in the back. The seat across from her was empty. In the front was a driver whose face Maren had never seen. Maren heard herself cry out, almost shouting, asking where he was, saying they had read out the name of the place where her brother lived, that they had even read the visiting hours, and demanding to know where he was. Roz didn't raise her voice in response. She said only 1 brief sentence, and it silenced Maren completely. He is with your brother. The car began moving. 18 minutes. Maren would later say that those 18 minutes were the longest journey of her life, longer than the 10 minutes she had spent pushing the cargo cart through the snow that night, longer than the 2 hours she had once spent sitting in a hospital corridor at 19, waiting for someone to call her mother's name. She sat with her back straight, staring through the darkened window, while her mind raced through every terrible thing a person could imagine. She didn't cry. She only counted the streetlights. Roz didn't say another word, and Maren was grateful to her for that. The car turned onto the familiar street, the one lined with maple trees that Maren had walked along every 2 weeks for the past 3 years, and the red brick building appeared ahead, with yellow light glowing in the lobby, and several windows still illuminated on the 2nd floor. The car hadn't fully stopped before Maren opened the door. She ran across the lawn, pushed through the glass entrance, and the night receptionist startled upright behind the counter. Maren said her brother's name. The receptionist looked at her, looked at the state she was in, then said that Mr. Kowalczyk was still in his room and still awake, but asked whether Maren had an appointment because this wasn't visiting time. Maren walked down the hallway, stopped outside the familiar door, and looked through the small glass panel. Wesley was sitting at his desk beneath a lamp, his back to the door, a brush in his hand as he bent over a new canvas. He tilted his head to study it, added another stroke, then leaned back to look again. Nothing had happened. Nothing had happened at all. The entire building was as quiet as it had been on every other night during the past 3 years, and her brother was mixing paint at 2 o'clock in the morning because he couldn't sleep, something that happened every week. Maren stood outside the door with both hands pressed against the glass and released a breath so long that it felt as though she had been holding it since the beginning of the night. She didn't go inside. She didn't want him to see her face like this. She turned back toward the lobby, and as she passed the glass entrance, she saw a vehicle parked across the street in the lot of the church opposite the facility. Its lights turned off. There was no snow on the hood. That meant it had been there for a long time. And the moment she noticed it, the door opened. The man who stepped out was tall, his dark coat unbuttoned, and he crossed the street in strides that weren't hurried, but leaned slightly to one side, the gait of someone trying to keep one side of his body from doing any work. He pushed through the lobby door, and beneath the yellow light, Maren clearly saw the face from the archive photograph, the faint scar along the left side of his jaw, and the white shirt beneath his coat, stained dark along his side, the stain spreading outward and already dried stiff around the edges. Her 12 stitches had torn open, and judging by how deeply the blood had soaked through, they had been open for a long time. Roz stood near the doorway and said quietly that he had been sitting there for 3 hours. Maren didn't understand. She asked whether he had really spent 3 hours sitting outside in the car while knowing that someone had just recited the name of this place. She asked why he hadn't gone inside. She asked why he hadn't warned the staff, hadn't stood outside Wesley's door, hadn't done anything at all. The man looked at her, and he didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice was rough and exhausted. The voice of someone who had spent 3 hours in a cold car with an open wound. He said, "You are the one who signs the papers for your brother, not me." Then he said nothing more. And Maren stood there in the empty lobby close to 3 o'clock in the morning, looking at the man half the city was trying to kill. A man who could have purchased the entire red brick building with a single phone call, and she understood that he had sat outside in the parking lot for 3 hours, bleeding, waiting for her to arrive, simply because the registration form at the reception desk bore a signature, and that signature wasn't his. The move happened during the night, and Maren could barely remember when she had agreed to it. She only remembered Roz placing a temporary facility transfer form in front of her, remembered that the final line contained a blank space waiting for the guardian's signature, and remembered that the man stood 3 steps from the table, saying nothing, applying no pressure, simply waiting until Maren picked up the pen with her own hand. Wesley was awakened close to 4 o'clock in the morning, and he didn't ask many questions. He only asked whether he could bring his paintings, and when they told him yes, he packed his art supplies more carefully than he packed his clothes. The house stood in Roland Park, built of gray stone, with thick walls and small windows set so deeply into them that they resembled narrow firing slits. From the outside, it looked like the old home of a prosperous family that had lived there for 3 generations, and only after stepping inside could a person understand that everything had been designed for another purpose, that this was a fortress disguised as a home. The following morning, Maren woke close to 10 o'clock, later than she had awakened on any morning in the past 2 years, and went looking for her brother. Wesley's room was on the 2nd floor at the end of the hallway, and by the time Maren reached it, the door was already open. He had set up his easel sometime earlier, angling it toward the window, and he stood there squinting outside. Beyond the glass was an old oak tree stripped bare of leaves, its black branches drawn against the January sky, while the morning sunlight slanted through them and fell in long patches across the wooden floor. Wesley heard his sister, turned around, and the first thing he said wasn't about the previous night, wasn't about why they had been moved in the middle of the night, and wasn't a question at all. He told her to come and look. He said his old room faced north, so the light remained the same color all day and made everything he painted turn gray. He said this room faced east, so the sunlight reached all the way across the floor in the morning and gradually faded in the afternoon, and that the fading was the valuable part, because only when the light faded could you see the colors changing. Then he said something that made Maren turn her face away. He said this was the first room he had ever had in his life with enough light to paint. Maren stood in the doorway with one hand gripping the frame, looking at her 19-year-old brother standing in that shaft of sunlight with a brush in his hand, and she confronted the worst thing she had faced since the night in the alley. It wasn't fear. It wasn't the question of who was hunting her. It was this. She owed a debt to a man she wasn't allowed to owe. That debt was growing larger with every passing hour, and somewhere inside her, she had no desire to repay it. She wanted her brother to stand in that sunlight. She wanted it to last, and she knew that desire was the rope binding her, not the black vehicle, not the new lock, not the $41,000. She went downstairs to the kitchen close to noon. The kitchen was spacious, with high ceilings, and he sat at the head of the table with a cup of black coffee and a stack of papers, wearing a clean shirt, his side properly bandaged by someone during the night. Marin didn't sit down. She stood at the opposite end of the table and asked him directly where she stood on his chessboard. He looked up. He didn't pretend not to understand the question, didn't ask what she meant, and didn't use the soothing voice men often used with frightened women. He folded the papers closed and said she stood where he could see her. Marin said that wasn't an answer. He said it was the only answer he had. Then he continued, speaking slowly without emphasizing any particular word, saying that 3 groups in the city were currently trying to discover who had pulled him from that alley, and 2 of those 3 groups now knew the answer. He said that as long as she remained outside, she was a point on the map that anyone could target. But inside this house, she was a point only he could target. He didn't avoid the truth when he said it, and that honesty disturbed Marin more than any lie could have. She asked what the price was. He didn't answer. She asked a second time. She said nothing was free, that she had lived for 27 years and had never received anything without paying for it somehow. So he should tell her. Tell her now, so she would know what she was signing. He looked at her for a long time. For one moment, Marin thought he was about to answer. His jaw shifted once, and then he lowered his eyes to the papers and said that today wasn't the day to have that conversation. He stood, picked up his coffee, and walked out of the kitchen. Marin remained alone in the middle of the room. She heard water boiling in a kettle someone had switched on, the wind moving through the oak branches outside, and the sound of Wesley dragging a chair across the second floor. The house was warm. The floor wasn't cold beneath her feet. The refrigerator contained food. More food than Marin had ever possessed at one time in any refrigerator of her own, and she realized that throughout the entire morning, she hadn't thought once about the rent due Tuesday, hadn't opened her banking app once, and hadn't calculated how much money she had left. She wasn't afraid of this house. That was the problem. She was afraid of the feeling that had been growing inside her chest since she woke. The same relief she had first tasted on the floor of her basement kitchen and had promised herself she would never taste again. She was beginning to feel comfortable here, and a person who began to feel comfortable was a person who had begun to stop looking for a way out. By afternoon, Roz called her down to the kitchen and said the person who had bandaged him the night before had done a poor job because it had to be done inside the car, that the wound had begun seeping again around noon, and that he refused to let anyone touch him. Marin asked why Roz was calling her, then. Roz said because he would only allow Marin to touch him. Marin stood motionless for several seconds. Then she told Roz to bring out the medical kit and told him to sit on the high stool at the end of the stone counter. This time, nothing was like the first. The first time, there had been the cold vinyl floor of her basement kitchen, a single yellow bulb hanging overhead, a sewing needle she had held over the flame of a lighter, a spool of thread bought from a grocery store, and half a bottle of cheap liquor. This time, there was a gleaming stone surface, a row of white lights beneath the kitchen cabinets shining directly downward, and an open medical kit containing proper sutures, forceps, sterile gauze, and an unopened bottle of iodine, supplies that even the emergency room where she had once worked needed special authorization to obtain. The first time, she had been so frightened that her hand trembled as she pushed the needle through for the first stitch. This time, her hand didn't tremble at all, and that was because she was angry. She cut away the old bandage. 3 stitches in the middle had torn open completely. The edges of the skin had separated, and the rest of the wound was tight and red. She told him that sitting in a cold car for 3 hours with an injury like this would have brought down even a healthy man, and he said nothing. She cleaned the wound, disinfected it, and heard his breath hiss through his teeth exactly once before he went silent again. Then she threaded the needle and began to sew, and at the same time, she began asking questions. She asked what would happen to the detective, named Brault. He remained silent for a beat, then said she would retire earlier than planned. Marin stopped the needle and looked up. She asked what that meant. He said it meant exactly what it sounded like. She had served for 30 years, her record was clean, and she would be offered full retirement benefits within the next month. Marin asked who would make the offer. He didn't answer, and she understood that the question itself was the answer. She lowered her eyes and continued stitching. After 2 stitches, she asked her second question. She asked what would happen to the man named Renzo in the underground garage. The man whose name she now knew was August Vespari looked straight ahead, his voice devoid of emotion, and said that Renzo wouldn't be visiting any garages or residential facilities ever again. A cold shiver traveled down Marin's spine, but she didn't ask another word. She felt something cold travel down both arms. She thought she ought to feel disgusted. She thought she ought to put down the needle, step away, and say that she wouldn't be part of this. But what she truly felt was something else, something heavier and worse, and it was closer to relief than horror, because that man had spoken aloud the name of the place where her brother lived. She hated herself for feeling it. She kept stitching. Then she asked her third question. She asked why he had paid her mother's medical debt. He shifted his position on the stool. He said she had saved his life, and he repaid what he owed. Maren said $41,000 wasn't how people repaid one night of having a wound stitched. They left a stack of money on the table, and that was the end of it. He said he didn't like owing anyone. Maren said that still wasn't an answer. Then she asked him directly how he had known her mother's name, how he had known which company held the debt, when the only things on her table that night had been several unopened envelopes from the facility where her brother lived. And that man, the man who had answered her question about a detective being forced into retirement, the man who had silently admitted what had happened to Renzo without blinking, the man who hadn't once in 10 days tried to make his truth sound easier to accept, looked down at the stone counter and said it wasn't important. Maren stopped moving. This was the first time. Of every question she had asked him, this was the first one he had avoided. She didn't ask again. She lowered her eyes and completed the final stitch, then tightened the knot more than necessary, tight enough to make him draw in a breath. Then she said, without looking up, that she wanted him to understand something. She said she had saved him because he was dying, not because he deserved to be saved. She said that night she hadn't known who he was, and even if she had known, she would still have done the same thing, but not for him, for herself, because she had once stood in a hospital corridor and listened while someone told her mother that her father had lain on the factory floor for 40 minutes before anyone called for an ambulance. She cut the thread, set down the scissors, and said one final thing. Don't mistake the fact that I wouldn't abandon a dying man for believing that you deserve to live. She looked up. He was watching her, and there was no offense in his eyes. He said, I know. Then he continued slowly, that is exactly why I can't let you leave. Maren was about to ask what he meant, but he had already stood, picked up the shirt draped over the back of the chair, and walked out of the kitchen, with his body leaning slightly to one side. She remained alone beside the stone counter with the soiled gauze and the forceps still stained with iodine, and she stood there for a very long time. She thought back over every word he had spoken to her from the night in the alley until now. Not one of them had been a lie. He had never promised her anything. He had never told her he was a good man. He had never wrapped any truth in softer language to make it easier to swallow, not even the truths that made him frightening. This man hadn't lied to her once, and that was precisely why what he had just said was so terrifying. Because a man willing to admit the worst things about himself, yet unwilling to answer a question about the medical bills of a woman who had been dead for 8 years, could have only one explanation. Whatever lay behind that question was worse than everything he had already admitted. The following morning, Wesley found a chess set in the living room cabinet, an old wooden set with several pawns chipped along the edges, and he carried it down to the kitchen and arranged it on the stone counter, as though the house belonged to him. When August passed by with a cup of coffee, Wesley looked up and asked whether he played. Maren was standing at the sink, and she almost interrupted, almost told her brother to leave him alone. But she stopped herself in time, and even years later she would never understand why she had remained silent in that moment. August set down his cup, pulled out a chair, and sat. The game didn't last long. Wesley played chess the way he painted. He didn't calculate which pieces he could capture. He calculated empty space. He would leave one entire side of the board wide open, and then suddenly a trap would appear there, before anyone had noticed it taking shape. August lost on the 23rd move. He sat staring at the board for several seconds, then asked about the 17th move, and Wesley showed him, explaining that right there, August had moved straight ahead, and that from the beginning of the game he had done nothing but move straight ahead. Whatever he wanted, he aimed directly at it, which meant that all anyone had to do was look at the piece he had just moved to know where the next one would go. Wesley meant nothing by it. He said it in the voice of someone commenting on the color of paint. Then he smiled and told August he needed to practice going around things. And August laughed. The sound was brief and rough, almost nothing more than a forceful breath, but it was real laughter. And Maren turned from the sink with both hands still wet, because she hadn't heard that sound once during the past 10 days. In that moment, in the sunlit kitchen with the chessboard and the three of them, everything looked like an ordinary morning in the life of an ordinary family. And that was what made the rest of the day so cruel. Wesley carried the chessboard upstairs. Maren waited until the sound of her brother's footsteps had completely disappeared along the staircase. Then she went into the sitting room, took the yellowed file from the cloth bag she had brought from the basement apartment, returned to the kitchen, and placed it on the stone counter in front of August. He looked at the cardboard cover, softened with age and worn at all four corners. He didn't need to read the label. Maren saw that. She saw the nearly imperceptible shift in his shoulders, the way the hand holding his coffee lowered the cup half a beat more slowly than usual. She said the name of the doc. She said 4 people had died. She said the investigative conclusion blamed operator error, and that the operator's name was Tomasz Kowalczyk. Then she said one final thing, that the case had been closed at the request of the port insurance company, and that company belonged to his family. August remained silent for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice didn't change. It was still low and even, but it had become slower. He said that night in her apartment, while she went to get water, he had sat up. He said he had sat up because he needed to know where he was and who was holding him, because that was the first thing a person did when waking in an unfamiliar place. He said there had been a stack of unopened envelopes on the kitchen table, and every one of those envelopes bore the same name, Kowalczyk. He said he had stood there in the middle of her kitchen, with 12 fresh stitches in his side, and read that surname 3 times. Maren asked why. He said because 11 years earlier, he had written that same name on another envelope. Then he told her. He said he had been 23 that year. He said his father had given him 3 tasks that week, and one of them was to carry an envelope to the home of a woman on the east side of the city, place it directly into her hands, wait for her signature, and bring the papers back. He said he hadn't asked what was inside the envelope, and he hadn't asked why it needed to be delivered. He said that at the time, he had believed he was doing something kind, that he was bringing money to someone who needed it. He said he still remembered that kitchen. He remembered the vinyl tablecloth patterned with tiny flowers. He remembered that the woman had needed 3 attempts to sign because her hand was trembling, and that after she finished, she had asked him in heavily accented English whether that meant everything was over now. He said he also remembered that in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame, stood a girl about 15 or 16 years old, holding a dish towel and watching him from beginning to end without speaking a single word. The stone kitchen fell completely silent. Maren could hear the heater and the sound of Wesley dragging a chair across the floor upstairs. She stood there and felt all 11 years fold together. She said, "So you knew?" He said yes. She said, "You knew from the first night?" He said yes. She asked whether that meant the $41,000, the 6 months of fees for her brother, the lock, the bicycle. All of it hadn't been because she had pulled him out of the snow, and this time August didn't evade her. He said no. He said that if she had been anyone else, he would have left a stack of money on the table, and she would never have seen him again. Maren gripped the edge of the stone counter. She spoke so quietly that even she had to strain to hear herself. She said, "Then you didn't save me. You were only making payments on your conscience." August didn't answer. He didn't argue with a single word, and it was the fact that he didn't argue that Maren couldn't bear. She continued, her voice still quiet, saying that for the past 8 years, she had believed her father had made a mistake. She had grown up carrying that belief. Her mother had died carrying that belief. And he had walked into their kitchen at 23 years old with that envelope in his hand and believed he was doing something kind. She said she would rather he had left her out on the street. Then she turned away. She climbed the stairs, went into her room, pulled her cloth bag down from the closet, and began to pack. Maren packed the way someone packed after moving too many times in one life. Quickly, neatly, without hesitating over what to leave behind. She folded 2 sweaters, rolled up a pair of socks, slipped her phone charger into the outer pocket. And while she did those things, one very practical question kept circling through her mind, where the 2 of them would sleep that night, because someone knew the address of the basement apartment, and someone had spoken the name of Wesley's former facility aloud in an underground garage. She was folding her coat when she realized someone was standing in the doorway. Wesley leaned one shoulder against the frame, both hands in his pockets, and he didn't ask what she was doing, didn't ask where they were moving next, didn't ask why. He only looked at the cloth bag on the bed for a moment and said, "Maren." She stopped moving. Wesley continued, his voice as ordinary as if he were talking about paint, saying that August didn't look at him the way people usually did. Maren straightened in the middle of the room. She couldn't say anything. Wesley didn't explain further. He never explained sentences like that. He simply said them and left them there. But Maren understood. She understood immediately, and more completely than her brother had intended to express. Because she had stood beside Wesley for 19 years, and she knew that look, the way people's eyes softened slightly at the corners, the way their voices automatically dropped half a tone, the way they spoke to him while glancing toward her, as though waiting for her to translate. He had been looked at that way all his life, but the man downstairs had sat across from him, lost to him in 23 moves, then asked about the 17th move as though asking an equal. Maren stood in the middle of the room with her coat in her hands, and for the first time that afternoon, she no longer knew what she was doing. At that same moment, on the first floor, Roz Kepler entered the study and placed a phone and a stack of printed pages on the desk. She said the Falconieri men hadn't found their own way into the meeting that night. Someone had opened the door for them. Then she said she had identified the person who opened it. August picked up the papers. He read them very slowly. They contained call records, 3 transfers routed through a small shipping company on the east side, and a photograph of a meeting in a parking lot 11 days earlier. The man in the photograph wasn't August's rival. It was Emmerich, 28 years old, the son of August's uncle, Sal. Roz said the reason was so simple, it was pathetic. August had been preparing to shut down the route that ran through the eastern warehouse, the route Emmerich had lived off for 4 years, and Emmerich had calculated that if someone else took August's place, the route would remain open. Roz continued, and what she said next was what made August put the papers down. 3 days earlier, when the internal investigation began, Sal had stepped forward and confessed. He said he had made the contact, that he had opened the door, that he had done it because he resented the succession. He had sat in a room with 4 members of the family and taken responsibility for everything, every detail, and he had confessed so smoothly that no one had suspected a thing. Roz said he had even prepared details only someone directly involved could have known. He had calculated everything carefully so no one would think of his son. August sat with that information for a long time. He didn't speak, didn't stand, didn't ask a single question. He looked at the photograph among the printed pages, the photograph taken in the parking lot, and remained silent long enough for Roz to glance at her watch twice. What occupied his mind wasn't Emmerich. It was the image of his 58-year-old uncle sitting in that room, describing every detail of a crime he hadn't committed, knowing exactly what would happen after he finished speaking, and still continuing until there was nothing left to confess. Then August spoke. He said to give the father and son 24 hours to leave the city. Their accounts, documents, vehicles, everything would be cut off, and if either of them ever returned to Baltimore, the agreement would end. When he finished, he closed the stack of papers. Roz remained still for several seconds, then said she needed to make something clear in her capacity as his advisor. She said everyone in the organization was waiting to see what he would do. She said he had inherited control only 6 weeks earlier, had just survived an ambush, had only just put down an internal rebellion, and if he now allowed the man who opened the door and the man who confessed in his place to leave the city unharmed, then by the following afternoon the entire city would understand that the head of the Vespari family was soft. People would test him, not once, but again and again, and every test would leave someone dead. August stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the bare oak tree, and he spoke without turning around. He said that man was destroying his own life to protect one person. He paused. Then he said, "I have only just learned that isn't weakness." Roz didn't answer. She picked up the papers and walked out, closing the door very softly behind her. August remained at the window a while longer. From the second floor, through the ceiling, came the sound of footsteps, the rasp of a zipper closing on a cloth bag, the sound of a drawer being shut. He listened to those noises, and he knew exactly where he had learned what he had just said. Not from his father, who had taught him that anything he couldn't control had to be cut away. Not from 20 years spent in a world where compassion was treated as an expense. He had learned it from a 27-year-old woman who had spent 8 years making payments on a debt that wasn't hers, who had abandoned her own life to protect one person, and who was now packing her belongings upstairs to leave. Maren didn't take the cloth bag with her. She finished packing, left it on the bed, sat down beside it, and remained there until nightfall because she couldn't think of a single safe address where she could take her brother. The following morning, she put everything back into the closet, one item at a time, and no one in that house mentioned what had happened. The next 4 days passed in a strange kind of silence. August left early and returned very late, and some nights he didn't return at all. Maren learned what was happening outside in exactly the same way the rest of the city did, through the television in the living room. On Tuesday night, a warehouse in the Eastern District caught fire. No one was injured, and the cause remained under investigation. On Wednesday morning, federal agents raided 3 container yards at the port. 11 people were detained, and a reporter standing behind a police barrier said it was the largest operation in 4 years. On Thursday night, a brief 30-second report stated that 2 transportation companies connected to the Falconieri Group had filed to cease operations in Maryland and move their offices farther north. Maren sat on the sofa watching those reports with a cup of cold tea in her hands, and she didn't ask August a single question when he came home. She had learned that there were some answers she didn't want to hear, and she had also learned that choosing not to ask was its own form of complicity. On Friday afternoon, Roz Kepler arrived, and this time she carried no stack of papers, only a large brown envelope. She placed it on the dining table, pushed it toward Maren, and sat in the chair opposite her. August stood in the kitchen doorway with one shoulder against the frame, saying nothing. Roz told her to open it. Maren did. Inside were 4 separate sets of documents. The first contained 2 complete sets of identification papers under different surnames, with social security numbers and fully constructed residential histories. The second contained the documents for a house in a small town in Vermont, photographs of a 2-story wooden home with trees in the backyard, and a transfer deed already signed by one party. The third was a letter confirming admission to a nursing program at a community college, 20 minutes from the house, beginning in the spring semester, with tuition paid for the entire course. The fourth was the record of a trust established in Wesley Kowalczyk's name, with a note stating that the monthly payments would be enough to cover all of his care and living expenses for the rest of his life. Maren read everything from beginning to end, without missing a single line. Roz said there were no conditions attached. She said Maren could leave that very night, that the car was ready, and that beginning the next morning, no one in the city would know where she was, not even Roz herself. The room fell silent. Maren placed one hand on the documents for the house in Vermont and realized she was holding the exact dream she had prayed for during the past 8 years. Not some other dream. That exact one, a place where her brother would have light, a source of money that would never run out, and the nursing degree she had abandoned in her 2nd year. She might never be offered anything like it again for the rest of her life. She remained silent for a long time. Then she pushed the envelope back to the center of the table. Roz looked at her. August didn't move. Maren said she wouldn't take it. Then she said she had one condition, and she addressed August, not Roz. She told him to reopen the Locust Point case, publicly, correct the investigative conclusion so that the words "operator error" were no longer written there, and pay full compensation to all 4 families. Roz repeated the number. 4. Maren said 4. She said her father had been one of the 4 people who died that day, and she had never met the other 3 or even known their names, but their wives and children had received envelopes exactly like the one her mother had signed for, and had lived for 11 years, believing that their loved ones had made a mistake. She said that if she only cleared her own father's name, then she would be nothing more than another person accepting an envelope. Roz put down her pen. She said she needed to make something clear so no one in the room misunderstood this as a matter of paperwork. She said the port operator's insurance company belonged to the family, and had belonged to the family since before August was born. She said reopening the case meant publicly admitting that the company itself had interfered to close an investigation into the deaths of 4 people, and that the person who had ordered that interference was August's father. She said it would be recorded in official documents, it would go through the courts, reporters would become involved, and everyone in the organization would read about it. She said August had inherited control only 7 weeks earlier. She said he had just put down a rebellion, had just allowed 2 people involved in it to leave the city unharmed, and that if he now dragged his own father into public disgrace with his own hands, then in the eyes of those who were expected to bow to him, he would no longer be seen as the heir but as the man dismantling everything. She said the cost wouldn't be measured in money, but in the number of people who would stop fearing him. Then she fell silent. No one spoke. Maren didn't withdraw a single word, and she didn't add another one. She only sat with both hands resting on the table and looked directly at the man standing in the kitchen doorway. She didn't beg. She had begged for many things during the past 8 years, and she had learned that begging never worked. August stood in the doorway and looked at her for a very long time. He looked at her long enough for Roz to glance in his direction. No one knew what he was thinking during those moments, and even years later, after everything had ended, Maren never asked. Then August stepped away from the doorway, walked toward the table, and spoke to Roz. "Prepare the documents." Reopening the case didn't happen quickly, and it wasn't remotely as easy as it would have been in a movie. It took 7 weeks. 7 weeks of paperwork, of meetings that dragged on for hours, of lawyers seated on opposite sides of a table reading through every line of statements written 11 years earlier. Roz Kepler handled it, and she did so without a single complaint, even though everyone knew she had opposed the decision from the beginning. By the middle of March, the original investigative conclusion had been formally withdrawn, and the words "operator error" disappeared from the record of the Locust Point dock accident. In their place was a new conclusion, one that clearly documented the condition of the load cable, clearly stated that its replacement deadline had been ignored for 14 months, and clearly recorded that the operator had reported the problem before the accident occurred. 4 letters were sent. One went to the Kowalczyk family's old address and was forwarded to the Stone House in Roland Park. The other 3 went to 3 families Maren had never met, and she never met them afterward either. She only knew that the letters arrived, and that 3 other wives somewhere in the city had finally read the truth that her mother had never lived long enough to see. Corinne Brault retired at the end of March, 14 months earlier than she had planned, exactly as August had said she would. But she retired with the conclusion bearing her signature corrected after 11 years, and on the final day she came to the Stone House to retrieve her yellowed file. She stood at the door for a long time before telling Maren that she was sorry she had come looking for her with such an intention. Maren said she knew. Brault said she would still do the same thing again. Maren said she knew that too. Then Brault left, carrying the cardboard box worn soft at all 4 corners that she had kept in the trunk of her car for 11 years. And this time she took it home, instead of carrying it with her in the car. August paid the price exactly as Roz had warned he would. For 3 straight months, the meetings grew longer and quieter. Some people arrived late. Some questioned decisions no one had ever dared to question before. 2 shipping routes were delayed without anyone offering an explanation. He endured all of it without complaining once, without ever mentioning who had asked him to do this, and Maren knew he never would, because during 11 weeks beneath the same roof, she had never once heard him blame anyone for anything. Maren didn't leave, but she didn't remain in the way Roz had proposed inside the brown envelope that day either. She wasn't someone being sheltered. She stayed on her own condition, a condition written into official documents and paid for with something money couldn't buy, and both of them understood that clearly. And because they both understood it, there was something between them that hadn't existed before: equality. She returned to school for the fall semester at a college in the city rather than in Vermont, and she paid the first semester's tuition herself with money she had earned. One morning in early April, while Maren was pouring coffee in the kitchen, Wesley came down the stairs holding a canvas in both hands, the paint not yet completely dry. He said nothing. He only placed it on the stone counter and turned it toward his sister. The painting showed a kitchen filled with sunlight. There was a dining table, and around that table sat 3 people. None of the faces were clearly drawn. There were only the shapes of their bodies and the light around them. Exactly the way he painted the cranes at the harbor, as outlines rather than details. Because from far away, who could ever see the details anyway? Wesley offered no explanation. He poured himself a glass of water and went back upstairs, leaving the painting behind. Maren stood alone in the kitchen with both hands holding the edges of the canvas, and she looked at it for a very long time. In her mind, she heard the words Ruth had spoken in the small break room with the humming refrigerator, words Maren had heard at the time without fully understanding, that life didn't ask whether people were strong enough before placing a burden on their shoulders, but it didn't ask before lifting one away either. There was one thing Maren Kowalczyk only came to understand after everything that happened, and perhaps it is something worth asking each of us to pause and consider. Kindness isn't an investment. It isn't something we give away while waiting for the day it returns with interest. It is something we offer without expecting anything in return, and precisely because we expect nothing, it has the power to change an entire life. On that January night, in the alley behind the warehouses, Maren didn't stop because she believed she would be rewarded. She stopped because she remembered far too clearly what it felt like to have the whole world pass by while no one bent down, a feeling she had carried with her since she was 16. And what she received in the end wasn't $41,000, wasn't a house in Vermont, and wasn't the protection of a powerful man. What she received was the first time in 8 years that someone sat across from her, asked what she wanted, and listened until she had finished answering. Sometimes in life, the most precious thing one human being can give another isn't money, but simply the experience of being seen as a human being. If you had been Marin that night, would you have ridden straight past, or would you have stopped? Leave your answer in the comments below, and press the like button if this story touched your heart. Subscribe to our channel, like and share this video, so we can continue bringing you more moving and meaningful stories every day. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel, which part stayed with you the most, and we hope you will share the thoughts that come from deep within your heart in the comments, because every word you share is something we sincerely value and listen to. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace each day beside the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.